ready for the coming food crisis yet? Because events are accelerating at a much faster speed than most people realize, and a global supply shock is about to trigger catastrophic levels of food insecurity all over the world. In America, food prices are already skyrocketing, and a perfect storm is threatening to dramatically collapse domestic food production, exacerbate shortages, and push prices even higher in the coming months. Industry insiders are warning that U.S. consumers are going to spend 20% more on groceries this year. Many farmers are losing their motivation to plant new crops as fertilizer prices have soared up to 500% in some states. All of this means that all we've experienced so far is just a hint of what is coming next. The facts we're about to expose in this video are truly shocking. But the best thing we can do in times like these is to stay informed so we can prepare for the challenges ahead. Before entering today's discussion, please don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel to keep updated with the latest news. Americans are suffering from the effects of the worst food inflation since the turn of the century. Even though government officials have been trying to blame the new price spikes on the latest global events, the most part of those increases came from inflation caused by runaway government spending over the past 2 years. The other part can actually be attributed to global supply chain disruptions and transportation issues. The crisis between Russia and Ukraine, however, is acting as a catalyst to a massive food supply shock that's likely to spark a worldwide food crisis and widespread shortages, aggravating our already existing problems. And the actions of the U.S. government are about to make things even worse. Farmers, economists, industry experts, and even the United Nations are warning that the U.S.-led sanctions imposed on the Russian economy in response to the offensive in Ukraine are going to result in devastating consequences for the entire planet. Ukraine is a major grain producer, but the conflict is likely to disrupt spring planting and harvest. While Russia is also one of the world's largest agricultural producers, but Western sanctions will prevent it from exporting goods to most countries that rely on its supplies. As Sébastien Abyss, a researcher at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs, noted recently, it's not just the global supply of grains that's going to be affected. He explains the two countries account for 80% of the world's sunflower oil production, and Ukraine is the world's fourth largest exporter of maize. The fighting in Ukraine continues to escalate, and the Russian offensive is intensifying along the all-important Black Sea coastline, preventing ships to come in and out to deliver goods to both countries and to send exports overseas. And now, the Western sanctions have cut off these two major crop producers from the rest of the world. Nothing is leaving the Ukrainian ports anymore, Abyss continued, and it's impossible to know what the country will be able to produce and harvest in the coming months. The conflict has already had dramatic consequences for Ukrainians who are struggling to find food amid the chaos, but it's also causing concerns for the many countries that depend on Ukrainian wheat and are increasingly worried that they will soon be unable to feed their people, he highlighted. We must not forget that this new crisis comes on top of the already very difficult context of the health crisis, which has already caused historic inflation and undermined food security in many countries, Abyss emphasized. Given that Russia is also the biggest manufacturer of fertilizer in the world, and China is a nation aligned with Russian interests and is second on the list of countries historically unfriendly to the United States and the West, the outlook is not good at all for American farmers. Last Friday, the green market's North American Fertilizer Index, which was already extremely high, has jumped another 16%, with urea, a main ingredient for fertilizer production, rising 22%. Potash, another key ingredient, largely produced by Russia, surging 34%. And the average price for standard fertilizer going up 49% on global markets compared to a year ago, and likely to increase even more in the next few weeks. The situation is becoming so worrying that Bloomberg analyst Alexis Maxwell is calling it a march to disaster. The main problem is that without fertilizer, farmland is significantly less productive. Industry experts estimate that the lack of fertilizer can collapse corn and wheat yields in the U.S. by more than 40%. And considering that prices are expected to go much higher, farmers will either have to plant without fertilizer or raise the prices of their products accordingly. But that increase can be much more acute than we imagine. Indiana Farm Bureau President Randy Cron says the cost of fertilizer is up as much as 500% in some areas. It would be unbelievable if I haven't seen it for myself, as I priced fertilizer for our farm in southern Indiana. Fertilizer is a global commodity and can be influenced by multiple market factors, including the situation in Ukraine, and all of these factors help drive up costs. On top of that, we're also struggling with soaring prices for gasoline and diesel, which are key for today's mechanized farming and for delivering food to consumers. The relentless rise in food prices has been a critical indicator of inflationary pressure. In some products, such as meats, the spike has been particularly notable. Pork and beef have climbed between 14 and 20% this year. According to CBS analysts, the cost of putting food on the table is the highest it has been in 40 years. Meanwhile, fresh data released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics last week have shown that the food price index went up 8.6% over the last 12 months, marking the largest 12-month increase since April 1981. All 6 major grocery store food group indexes increased in February. The index for fruits and vegetables had the largest increase, rising 2.3%, its largest monthly increase since March 2010. The index for fresh fruits increased 3.7% over the month, and the index for fresh vegetables rose 1.3%. The index for dairy and related products rose 1.9%, its largest monthly increase since April 2011. The index for meats, poultry, fish, and eggs increased 1.2% in February as all of its major component indexes increased, BLS reported. Chris Hagenow, Vice President of Iowans for Tax Relief, highlighted that inflation will continue to hit agricultural inputs such as fertilizer and equipment, which will contribute to the increasing cost of food. In his view, inflation is dangerous because it's a hidden tax and it destroys the income earned by both farmers and workers. This inflation is a direct consequence of the out-of-control spending that's plaguing the federal government. Our national debt has hit $30 trillion. And President Biden and the Democrats believe that spending and printing money has no economic consequences. Farmers and consumers will continue to see higher prices, and it will damage the economy, Hagenow said. And when we add all of these price increases and domestic production decreases to the imminent shortages that will come from the Ukraine crisis, we're looking at extremely dramatic price hikes and severe damage to the economy. Even the United Nations is sounding the alarm over a hunger hurricane that's already being felt in some parts of the globe. A couple of days ago, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a stark warning about the wider threats of the Ukraine crisis. He stressed we must do everything possible to avert a hurricane of hunger and a meltdown of the global food system. His statement echoed similar worries voiced by the head of the World Food Program, David Beasley just a few days earlier. He said the attacks in Ukraine could take the global hunger crisis to catastrophic levels. Supply chains and food prices will be dramatically impacted. In the United States, this will mean supply shortfalls and explosive prices. But elsewhere in the world, it'll mean starvation. And our leaders are definitely not helping to ease the situation, as Glenn Harlan Reynolds, a professor of law at the University of Tennessee, has explained in a recent op-ed published in the New York Post. The fertilizer shortage the U.S. is about to experience is going to spark consequences similar to what happened to Sri Lanka when the island nation decided to abandon artificial fertilizers. According to reports from Foreign Policy, Sri Lanka faced a brutal and swift economic and humanitarian disaster after its farmer lost access to artificial fertilizers. Against claims that organic methods can produce comparable yields to conventional farming, domestic rice production fell 20% in just the first 6 months. Sri Lanka, long sufficient in rice production, has been forced to import $450 million worth of rice, even as domestic prices for this staple of the national diet surged by about 50%. The ban also devastated the nation's tea crop, its primary export and source of foreign exchange. The agency added that human costs have been even greater. Prior to the virus outbreak, the country had proudly achieved upper middle income status. Today, 500,000 people have sunk back into poverty. Now, just take a moment to imagine what can happen in America, one of the world's biggest agricultural producers. As the Farm Bureau president noted, this problem is not going away anytime soon. It has been developing for several years, so unfortunately the solution will take time too, Cron said. Farm Bureau is urging the Biden administration to look for ways to bring fertilizer prices down, including resolving supply chain issues and removing import duties. These rising input costs will have a major impact on all of us this spring as we prepare to put crops in the ground, and they will eat away much of the profit we might have expected to make from high commodity prices, he continued. The Biden administration and government bureaucrats don't seem too bothered about this looming food crisis. When asked about fertilizer and food shortages in a recent interview, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack's response was, maybe sacrifices are necessary. It's safe to say that neither Vilsack nor Biden or any of the politicians in Washington will be the ones making sacrifices. That's probably why John Katsimatidis, the billionaire supermarket CEO, is now advising Americans to stock up now, because food inflation will only get much worse. I've seen price increases coming through for the month of March. I've seen them coming through April and May, said the CEO of New York City supermarket chain Gristades in an interview with Fox News on Tuesday. Between price increases and shrinkflation, where it used to be 32 ounces, now it's going to be 28 ounces. It's anywhere from a 12 to 20% increase in food prices, he alerted. For the past 3 years, global rates of hunger and famine have been rising exponentially. In America, food insecurity hits 35 million people annually. And with the worsening confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, we're now facing the risk of imminent famine and starvation in more places around the world. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakiri, stressed in a recent report. And the US is not immune to any of this. The risks of spillover are real and scary. And with historic inflation, surging fuel prices, and shrinking food supply, the United States is about to face the same fate Sri Lanka once did. But once again, those responsible are unlikely to be held accountable for their reckless actions. Actually, perhaps some of them will. After all, food shortages caused ravaging riots that led to the overturning of governments during the Arab Spring, and dissatisfaction with the US government continues to grow. So maybe we should start preparing for some civil unrest too. Thank you very much for watching this video. We look forward to your comments underneath.